All right, so hello and welcome to everyone who's joined us so far. I think we're going to give it a couple more minutes to allow some folks to filter in, and then we'll get going from there.
Cool. So as people are joining in, I guess we'll just kind of kick off because I think we've got some people. I wish we had some background music to kind of entertain you guys. But I guess in the meantime, I'll just introduce who we are. I am Andrea, and I head customer experience over here at ProdPad, and with me is our CEO and co-founder, Janna Bastow. Today, we'll be talking about Vanity Metrics, which is a super interesting topic. So Jan's going to be kicking this off shortly. If you guys have any questions while the webinar is running, just click on the Q&A or the chat bubbles on your Zoom options, and I will be reading them back as we go. With that said, Janna, I think you can kick this off.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for the intro, and welcome everyone. Really good to get a chance to chat to you. And I want to talk to you today about Vanity Metrics and really what's wrong with them and how it plays out amongst you and your companies. Let's get going. So as Andrea said, I'm Janna Bastow. I'm one of the co-founders here at ProdPad. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Come say hi to me on Twitter at Simply Bastow. Talk to me about product. I am a product manager originally, and now CEO and founder of ProdPad, but always happy to chat. Now, a lot of you might know me from some of the things that I go around talking about. A lot of you might know me from some of my talks where I tell everyone to go ditch their timeline roadmaps. Really where I'm going with this is, talking about how this format of roadmap makes you look great today, where your bosses and your board, they love the certainty that this format gives them, but how it sets you up for failure. Because if you deconstruct this format of the roadmap, it gets you a chart. It's basically mapping out time versus things to do. And you have this x-axis along the top, creating this timeline. And at first, it seems pretty easy and intuitive to use, but, especially in the short term, but the more you plan and the further out you go, the harder it becomes to manage. And because you've got that timeline sitting on the top and it's always marching forward, no matter what you put on that roadmap, everything always includes this due date and some time estimate. And that's just by this format of this roadmap. And so as a result, you end up with this big pile of features, a big pile of deadlines, and it's all based on this big pile of assumptions that you've been making. And so the first assumption that you're making with this format is that you know how long each feature is going to take, which again might be easy for the stuff that you've broken down in more detail and is in the really short term. You've had your developers give you estimates for, but the further down the list you go, the less clarity you've actually got. And you're also assuming that nothing else is going to come in to mess up your timeline. No new changes in the market, no new competitors, no fresh ideas coming from customers, no need for iteration. And you're also assuming that each of these features is going to work as soon as they launch. So let's say you've put 3 weeks to build that new checkout page. Then at the end of 3 weeks, it's going to be converting exactly as well as expected, and you're free to move on to the next thing, right? Well, as we know, usually not always. And so by explicitly adding these features to the timeline, you're actually assuming that each of these features should definitely exist, that they deserve to exist, that they form part of the strategy and therefore should be codified. And so at the end of the day, using this timeline roadmap, you're making one big dangerous assumption that nothing is going to change. And so what could possibly go wrong? Well, you're making up these release dates, which is forcing your developers on these stressful marches to launch on time, which is often creating your sales and your customer teams to have these, expectations that you simply can't meet. And oftentimes it means that you're actually missing market opportunities, other things that are happening out there, and leading you to build, sometimes like downright building the wrong thing. And this leads to you being a sad product manager. And we don't want any of this, so we look at whether there's other ways to do this. Now, the thing is that I've had this conversation over and over and over again with lots of product managers, and individuals that I speak to get it. I've never met an individual who didn't intuitively understand this, but somehow it never seems to really stick with organizations, or more often than not, I'm getting pushback from people who are talking about how it's going to work within their orgs itself. especially the big ones. The larger the organization, the more likely that I'm hearing this pushback from people. So I end up fielding a whole bunch of questions from product managers who are absolutely right. You know, they can't just rock up to work tomorrow having ditched their timeline roadmap. You know, I get that this ProdPad way isn't just going to slot comfortably in with the regular processes. Their company just isn't ready for that yet. And so I want to look at what's actually going on at these companies and how to get past this, because there are ways to start making this change, and there are ways to look at you know, what's going on in these companies and to start moving them towards this. So let's look at what's actually happening within companies, particularly large companies. Large companies have this, what they call fiduciary duty, to increase shareholder value. At the end of the day, it's about increasing the money that's going out to their shareholders. And CEOs are incentivized to show this quarter-on-quarter, year-on-year growth. If they don't, they're often turfed. You see CEOs who just don't simply last very long in their role. And so management style lends itself to these slow incremental improvements, either driving costs down or driving revenues up, but rarely giving any opportunities to invest in proper future growth. And one of the things that's really key here is that predictability is a huge factor. You know, the upward growth doesn't even have to be that much. Even in like the sub 1% per year is often fine, as long as it's going up and as long as the outcomes match the forecasts. You know, unpredictability more than anything spooks investors, which can actually have a bigger knock-on effect than anything operational happening within the company. So predictability is actually king. And so the best way to get predictability is to actually break the business up and understand it in smaller, more manageable chunks. And this sort of makes sense, right, from a management standpoint. But what it basically leaves you with is silos. You know, here you are, you've now broken your teams up into, you know, you've got your sales, you've got your marketing, you've got your R&D, and R&D and this is where product and development sits. You've got HR. You've probably got a bunch of other different silos depending on what the company is actually operating in. And the company actually breaks the teams up into these silos and understands each one separately before looking at how each one plays into the bigger picture. And these silos are leading us into dangerous territory, because this is where vanity metrics start to rule. So each division lead actually finds themselves competing to max out their own whatever proprietary metrics they've come up with, instead of collaborating for the good of the business. So in this example, we've got the marketing chaps pointing out, you know, that they've got some great metric here, but does this metric actually lead to the success of the business, or is it just some metric that makes marketing look good? So it's easy for one division to create something that works for them, but can cause bad knock-on effects for another side. Like, for example, you know, these siloed decisions make sense for the bottom line in one area, but can be, you know, counterintuitive to another area. Like this chap here who's been able to get his costs down, but obviously it's causing complaints to go up. But not his problem, it's going to cause problems in the support department, but again, not his issue. And these silos are measured in different ways. If you start looking at how management looks at these different silos, these different areas, is whether they are profit centers or whether they are cost centers. So a profit center is something like sales or marketing. These are areas of the business that when you put money in, they're designed to earn more money back. Or cost centers, areas of the business that need to exist but tend to cost the business more money than you get back in them. And do you know where product and customer service and innovation sit? We're actually seen as a cost center. And so the main driver for an exec at most businesses is to keep costs of product down, to control the costs, to push costs down in our area. And that is often why you see us being measured in the way that we are. And so sales is measured by the revenue. You hire a bunch of salespeople, you make a bunch of calls, and you get a number of dollars out one end. Marketing is measured by the return on investment. You put a bunch of dollars towards marketing, a bunch of advertising dollars go out, and you get a return on investment. Development. Look at how development and product is measured. Oftentimes in a lot of these IT-led organizations, we've been reduced to our velocity, our burn down charts, how many man hours, how many story points we can get out the door. Innovation has been reduced to how many points we can get done rather than whether we're actually solving problems. And it basically gets us trapped in this old pattern of writing finer and finer grained specs, breaking them down into points, which are really just a rough measure of time, and then measuring things like velocity, like how quickly can your team burn down through a stack of points. At the end of the day, this model of working simply optimizes for building the most features as fast as possible. At the end of the day, it really is focused on output when it should be focused on being outcome focused. You know, all this pointsing and burning down at high velocity rarely leaves room for discovery, and instead usually leads to team burnout and tech debt. But credit where it's due. This method is really good for managing costs in product and development. It does give an easy way to see how the costs of development are tied to what's delivered. And so when it's all added up together with all the other cost and profit centers, a sense of predictability can be achieved. You know, no CEO has to lose their job and no stocks are taking a plunge. But you know, and if they want to deliver this roadmap, for example, surely the answer is just to throw more developers at it, right? We've all seen this happen in our companies, but everyone knows that you can't just simply throw a whole bunch of developers at something and throw a whole bunch of features at something, because you end up with a whole bunch of features, a Frankenstein of a product, and everyone knows that a bunch of features is not the answer to building a good product, especially as you start hitting product maturity and your product becomes a Frankenstein that no one wants to use. So what do you do when you end up with a product like this? Tech debt, an unhappy team, and you're still being told to build a roadmap filled with features that's totally output based. It's all about the points and not about the discovery at all. Well, I actually see a few things happening. Like, we've got people saying that my boss expects it. I can't change the way that I work. My boss absolutely has to have it this way. Or the other one I see is sales is relying on me. This argument sometimes comes from teams where it's very sales-led. Sales has already sold a particular thing, and therefore the development team simply has to build it. Sometimes this company is operating very much like an agency, but it isn't pricing adequately to operate as an agency, which is a really big trap that a lot of companies get stuck in and can be very detrimental to the health of that company in the long term. Other times it's sales is asking for it because they're looking for logos and brands. Either way, it is a bit of an unfair trap, and I see it as execs and sales passing the buck. I think this explains why so many product managers are in a stressful position. Other departments are basically taking this buck and passing it to product managers and leaving us with this mess to clean up. We're being asked to give predictions in this unpredictable environment, and we're the ones who look bad when we don't deliver. I mean, we could pass the buck further down the chain to the developers and put the onus on them to do better estimations, but most of us are better people than that, and we actually act as gatekeepers. We act as protectors of our development teams so they can focus on the coding work and doing their best work there. So product managers play the impossible task of playing project manager for initiatives that are never given the right amount of time for planning. And you know, we end up having to protect our developers from the having to come up with these super detailed waterfall-like estimations. But when things don't go the right way, the buck seems to stop with us, when instead we should be able to be pointing back up and saying, hey, why are we the ones being asked to come up with these impossible estimations, given, you know, like, why are you selling stuff that we don't actually have yet? Why are you asking for things when we're not given the proper amount of time to plan out these projects? We shouldn't be doing these all-encompassing projects in the first place. So that said, no wonder being a product manager is actually rated as one of the most stressful jobs out there. Other divisions have actually found ways of coping with this uncertainty. So some examples here, like your VP sales, your sales director, doesn't guarantee that her 10 salespeople is going to result in 10 million sales this year. She doesn't actually know that, but she does have a sales pipeline showing deal flow along with a percentage likelihood of completing on deals. So she's not having to say, this thing is going to be out by this time if you put in this many dollars at this point. They're not broken down by that. They have a percentage likelihood and a pipeline of things happening. These are all rough estimates, not promises of exactly how much and when money is going to land. And it works. This is now quite standard, having a pipeline type of forecast. You also see this with marketing. Marketing gets away with it too. Have you ever heard that saying of half your advertising dollars go to waste? You just don't know which half. I mean, marketing itself is just one big experimentation engine with a lot of unknowns playing into the ROI calculations. And yet marketing divisions the world over keep operating pretty freely without making, what we have to do, like these 2-year plans of promising what they're actually going to deliver. Great marketing companies have enough freedom to respond to current events and can change their plans based on what's happening around them. And that's actually no more than what we're asking for in product development, to be able to adjust our plans, to be able to be flexible, to be lean. And so if different areas of the organization are able to find their own ways of dealing with this uncertainty, then perhaps there's things that the product team can do as well. But it's not just about the product people. This isn't just a gripe about us. It's also good for business. Let's look at how this is actually good for the business itself. When you've got this consistent growth, you end up with happy CEO and shareholders. You see these numbers creeping up, but it's actually a trap. The thing is that these numbers are going up. Everyone looks like, everything looks like it's going smoothly. But what tends to happen is that these companies lose sight of the bigger picture. And so they get really good at operationalizing on these, maximizing profit from the profit centers, maximizing or minimizing costs from the cost centers, and keeping this year-on-year growth. Even if it is just a sliver of growth year on year, and getting their bonuses, but they're missing the bigger picture. They're often missing this potential of this larger maximum. And so by optimizing for the short term, they end up leaving behind the option to be flexible and to solve new problems in the future. Other companies in the industry often find themselves, they often find themselves with other companies in the industry passing them by. Every company in the world has other startups who are nipping at their heels. Smaller startups are always going to be disrupting and taking chances and working faster than any other company who's larger. I mean, let's take a look at what's happening in banking. We've got companies who are hundreds of years old, generations old, and yet they are having literally hundreds of different companies nipping at their heels, taking all the more profitable, interesting areas, but leaving the less profitable, interesting areas of the business. No one wants to touch current accounts, but everyone wants to touch, fixing mortgages and lending and cards and all these other areas. And so the reality is, every product starts reaching this point of maturity. And as we said, especially as companies start maturing, and every company starts reaching this point where it starts plateauing. And the companies who are most likely to be affected by this are the ones who are at the absolute top of this plateau, the ones who are growing by fractions of a percentage. These are just a selection of companies who are growing super, super slow, but their base numbers are so big that they haven't actually sort of taken a look around to see how many different companies are nipping at their heels. So the only way to break out of this local maxima is to test areas of operation outside of their comfort zone. And this experimentation can be costly. And for many reasons, it can be awkward and uncomfortable for the organization. For any organization with poor product culture, who are used to delivering results within their silos, who are following these vanity metrics, they aren't incentivized. They don't feel safe to test these boundaries. For any CEO who's running a company who doesn't feel safe to take a dip in these numbers, not because, he might lose his bonus, but because he might lose his job. Oftentimes companies are just terrified of taking this leap. And so it's at this point that the CEO starts sweating around the collar. This happens all over the place. But look at where companies are actually excelling, the type of companies who are, this is a comparison of the top companies from 2008 on the right-hand side versus the largest companies in 2018 on the left-hand side. You can see that only one of the companies, Exxon, has actually survived and stayed in this top 10 list. The rest of them are the companies that we know as the fast-moving tech companies who experiment and move. Another great example of this, sorry, this one's a bit fuzzy, but this is a great example because this is the S&P, which is looking at the top 500 stocks. And the top 500 stocks is represented by the black line at the bottom. So that's the top 500 performing stocks right there. But then you see the Netflix, Amazon, and Google lines outperforming there. And like, look at Netflix, that one's absolutely skyrocketing above, even Amazon and Google, just way, way above what everyone else is performing. And these are the companies who continuously deliver, who continuously iterate, who continuously move forwards. You know, this isn't just about saving product managers' sanity. This is about performing well and above the rest of the industry. And it's also about saving your company, because every company that ever has or does exist will one day go bust. It's just a matter of when. And this is actually a quote that I heard from somebody who worked for a bank. This is a bank who'd been around for 170 years. They had just survived the downturn of 10 years ago, when everyone got bailed out by their respective taxpayers 10 years ago. They'd only just barely survived. You know, we were looking at it in terms of, you know, are you going to survive the next few generations? This is a multi-generational company. Is this bank going to survive the next few generations or even the next one? Or is this the generation that this bank takes a fall? How many other companies are going to take a fall in our generation because there's been so much change? If you are in one of these slow-moving companies is growing at 0.1% per year, is this, you know, your generation? How much longer do you have? So, you know, how do you be a Netflix in a world full of blockbusters? And let's look at it this way. Blockbuster had plenty of chances. They had people internally who advocated for new modern models. They had people there who saw Netflix, but they couldn't get the organization as a whole to embrace it. They actually passed on the option to buy Netflix for pennies on what it's worth now. But doing so would have represented a risk. It would have represented a dip in that tidy and predictable quarter-on-quarter growth. And you know what? Their executive team just wasn't ready to stomach it. And we all know how that ended up for Blockbuster, who just couldn't keep up with the times. Kodak was another example. They had the patents and the technology for digital photography, but they didn't dare cannibalize their existing high-margin, old-school, film-based product lines. And as a result, they were left in the dust because technology and consumer desires changed too quickly. Another example is BlackBerry. Did you know that their most profitable years were actually the 2 years after the iPhone was released? They actually famously didn't react to the changes in the market. And you know, that nice, comfortable up and to the right graph gave them this false sense of security. By the time their numbers actually started to fall, they were so far behind in technology that they simply couldn't compete on any real front. So if you're finding yourself at one of these companies with an outdated view on how to operate, what can you do to help make that change? Well, this is a typical product manager answer. It depends. It depends on the context of where you're actually coming from, the context in which you're starting from. I like to think about it the sphere of influence that you have. Does your company already have a culture and a mindset that's ready for this, or are you looking at a fight all the way? You know, are you getting buy-in from the top? Are you the CEO, or you know, do you have the CEO's ear? Are you one of the execs that have a say in the matter, or are you having to more delicately make a case to your boss? Are you part of a big company, or are you part of a small company? Do you have people and training in place? Do you have tools and tactics that are already being used? Or is this, you know, are you a slow-moving ship right now and this is all brand new? So it sort of depends, but there are things that can be done from any starting point. So I'm going to be talking about some of those. Now, Culture is actually really interesting to think about, and to think about how to actually go about changing it. I had this really interesting conversation over the weekend, and we talked about the concept of culture as calcification, like this geological sediment that's layered over time. This is why you can't change a company's culture by throwing in foosball tables and beer fridges. I see culture as this pattern of behavior. It's the attitudes and the ways of working that are brought to work each day by each individual, but it's also the history of attitudes. So each company has a unique culture that is the product of its people, its history, and the current context. And culture can and does change every day, but is built up on this sort of almost sediment, this calcification that's been created over time. And this is why you can't just change culture with a snap of fingers. A reorganization of your team is unlikely to just magically fix culture. As a matter of fact, if not done carefully, it could actually exasperate and make things worse. But it can be changed over time. You can chip away at it, you can address it, you can iterate on it. A larger org is going to have more of this calcification. It's going to have more culture to change. It's going to have more habits to change. Whereas a smaller company is going to have less history. Therefore, it's going to be easier to change the culture. And so the trajectory of a company can be changed by changing the culture, which is in turn changed by chipping away at these old habits. Now, it is best attacked from as high up as possible with exec buy-in, but even without explicit executive buy-in, there are things that you can do. So if you're approaching from the bottom up, try to regularly try and share different tools and tactics. Whether this is advocating for an occasional hackathon, so your team gets even if it's just practice with thinking outside the box, even if it feels like it's not going to make a dent in the bigger picture, it's worth doing. Try switching to a lean roadmap format for just a month and see how the organization reacts to it, see how they work with it. Buy copies of Lean Startup or Marty Kagan's Inspired or whatever else is popular that month and share them with colleagues. Share articles and tips in your Slack group. Teach yourself and then coach others around you to make lean approaches feel that little bit less scary. Find the other advocates in your company who think like you and start internal guilds. Start a trend, start a movement. And lots of small exposures can change attitudes over time. It provides this sort of interest and incentive to get training in new methods that'll allow the company to move faster and make better product decisions. It can start chipping away at the old guard attitudes that resulted in that sedimented or calcified culture that exists today. So along with telling you things like ditch your timeline roadmap, I'm also going to give you some extra tricks. Ditch your vanity metrics is a big one. So try moving away from vanity metrics and focus on OKRs, or objectives and key results. They're designed to align your teams around common company-wide goals while giving individual teams autonomy to find their own best route. Ask questions like how your metrics are going to solve problems for the business. Ask how they contribute to the longevity and continuation of the business. Ask how they play with other parts of the business. Vanity metrics shouldn't be able to be gamed by one division at the expense of another division. Each division or team's objective should roll up to tell part of the larger story of the company's vision. And tie those objectives into your roadmap so that they become part of your company strategy. And change how you're actually measured. The old way to be measured is by how many story points you and your dev team can crank out as sort of a rubric for how much value the company is getting for their investment in the product development division. The new way is to start reporting on how many experiments you can run. It changes the mindset from delivery of specific features by dates and instead allows you room for discovery and experimentation, while still giving the exec team an idea of what they actually get out of their investment. After all they actually really want is for this smart team that they've hired to do the best they can to maximize their investment. It's up to us, the product people, to point out that counting stories is actually counterintuitive, and that counting experiments is a much better indicator of long-term success. And the best way to get through to any person is to speak their language. So PMs can speak about customer journey mapping and discovery until the cows come home. But we often struggle to communicate upwards to our execs. We don't often speak their language. And our execs want to know what's going on that's going to affect the bottom line. They don't really care about the sentiment that came out of that last user test. So show them the money. Make a case in the language that makes sense to the business. Talk about risk. Talk about how the investment in the company that they're making is at risk if they don't invest in the right areas to defend against competition and other market forces. Talk about the product portfolio in the same way a hedge fund manager might talk about their investments. They wouldn't put everything in purely safe, slow-moving bonds because nothing would ever expand. Nor would they put everything in silly, high-risk startups. They'd probably have a risk portfolio, like a risk planning layout where they'd have some things in slow-moving stuff and some stuff in high-risk investments. So explore your company's appetite for risk and propose almost micro investments in these initiatives that make sense in the wider picture. So for example, Google might be able to justify 20% of their time in R&D. Now that might not be reasonable for everyone, so can you convince your team to start with just 2% or 0.2%? And this is the remit of our product leaders, talking to the executives and making sure that they understand how good product investments can help their organizations become product-led and how it's important and how it's going to actually impact the business itself. And where possible in your remit, invest in people and in training. It's one thing to throw new tools at a team, but something entirely more powerful about ensuring the team actually understands why the tool exists and how it'll help and how to use it to its best power. So training is an excellent way to accelerate this sort of culture change. It's why we provide onboarding and training services to complement our ProdPad tools. It's specifically aimed at larger companies who need more than just a simple nudge to change their mindset. And so at the very center of this is the idea of this strong product culture. So Marty Kagan actually calls it IT culture, which is the old school way of working, and product culture. Product culture sits at the center. And it's really about making sure that people feel comfortable sharing suggestions with you, that they speak up and they understand the problems that they're solving and how they play out across the business, that they're not pitching vanity metrics and running off in different directions and competing against each other. That people are challenging themselves and pitching in to help with the product. The thing with a product culture is that it can change, it does evolve. Every company has a unique product culture, and every culture changes day by day as people change as well. And I like to think about product culture as a product itself, something that can be measured, cultivated, learned from, iterated on, and improved on. And I'd also say that product culture is the most important product that you'd ever work on. So with that, I know that we've got some questions coming in, so I'd like to open it up for questions, and we can go from there.
Guys, so definitely take this opportunity right now to either pop a question on the Q&A or the chat. I guess we'll give it a few minutes. Don't be shy. We're definitely here to answer your questions. One thing that I found really interesting as you were talking is definitely the bit on vanity metrics. I personally think NPS is one of those vanity metrics because a lot of companies tend to take it, tend to approach it incorrectly. CSAT is another one. Definitely working in support just because you got 95% satisfaction rate. It doesn't really mean anything. It really is just a vanity metric. And what happens a lot of the time when those numbers go down actually has nothing to do with support. You're just measuring one specific encounter and not, possibly the actual satisfaction of the product with the user. And as I say that, I just had someone just say thanks. Cool. But yes, do you want to continue that conversation?
Yeah, I remember when you first started with us, you came loaded with a whole bunch of different uh, uh, metrics that you'd carried over from previous experience. And other people in the company came over with a whole bunch of different metrics that they had. And as a team, we looked at all of these and realized that a lot of them just weren't really contributing to the bottom line. And so over time, we've actually ditched a whole bunch of our vanity metrics here and started focusing on things that makes more sense for the business itself. So, one of our core metrics is looking at less about, individual metrics like, how is this one team doing, but, how are we doing with keeping our customers on board for, 12 months or longer, for example. And that's something that isn't just something that marketing has a hand in, isn't just something that success has a hand in, isn't just something that development has a hand in. It's something that all teams play a hand in and can all contribute to.
Yeah, absolutely. We just had a question pop in. How would you experiment in a B2B space, a space that is driven by sales and customer commitments, a space where it's harder to run A/B or MVP tests because your user base is much smaller?
Yeah, cool. You
Christina,
know, you know what? You're speaking my language because I've spent most of my career working in B2B, and so I've never had never been in that space where I had so much traffic that I could A/B test the smallest little button and get reasonable, realistic, statistically significant differences in whether light gray or dark gray makes a difference on a button or something like that. And so you can test with B2B customers. It just takes a different approach. So A/B testing is probably not the right approach, but you can be taking prototypes that you create and putting them in front of people. With B2B, you can actually benefit much more from a mixture of qualitative and quantitative, doing one-to-one user tests, doing beta testing with people, surveys, asking questions, collecting feedback. You've got a lot more remit for understanding what it is that each individual customer wants, and then mapping that out and figuring out what the grander problems are. Now, it also depends on how B2B you are. I mean, are you talking about, you are landing, I'm not sure if you've heard the terminology of landing whales, like massive, huge, like $1 million deals, or you're talking about landing $1,000 deals or $100 deals. And therefore, have you got thousands of customers or just one a year sort of thing? So your approach will differ based on that, but there's different approaches depending on, the context that you're in and, how much effort you can put into testing each sort of thing. In terms of experimenting with them, there are lots of approaches. We do that here at ProdPad. One of the things that's worked really well for us is having a Slack group just for our customers. And whenever we want to test something out, we'll ping something out into that group. It might be a survey to fill out. It might be an invite to come play in a Marvel prototype. It might be an invite to jump on a call with our product designer or customer experience person or whoever it is that wants to talk to you and get feedback that way.
Yes, absolutely. And just as an example, our designer actually popped in a user test today. And I've been running a video user tests on learning material. So definitely running different types of user testing will help. We have a couple more questions that just popped up. Can you highlight one or two measures that drive breakdown of silos? Cross business silos like marketing and product and team silos.
Can you give some more examples? Can you highlight one or two measures that drive breakdown of silos?
Measurements, perhaps?
I'm not quite sure I quite understand the question.
Scott, if you could actually please clear that up for us and rewrite it, because I'm having a...
So the way that I interpret this is, you've got these silos. You've got sales, you've got marketing, you've got R&D or product and development or whatever you want to call it. And you've got these different teams who often are measured separately. You've got your CMO who's working to make the best marketing division they can. You've got your CTO who's trying to make the best tech division they can. You've got your CRO who's trying to make the best sales division they can. You know, you're also seeing breakdowns in communication between them. You're seeing them quite literally sometimes competing against each other, you know, almost sometimes throwing each other under the bus, going, well, my numbers turned out great this quarter. How did yours go? You know, at the end of the day, they should be all pulling in the same direction. They're all dependent on the same ship staying afloat at you know, at the end. But you see these sort of almost competitive areas breaking out, almost different cultures breaking out within these different teams. And I think that comes from often the sheer size of some of these divisions, the sheer you know, difference between them and how they've grown.
So Scott did clarify and said, any metrics or OKRs that promote cross-team collaboration?
Oh, I suppose that any OKRs that would promote cross-team collaboration. Interesting question. One of the things that I think about with OKRs is I try not to refer to them as OKRs, because what always throws me off with that is that OKRs refers to objectives and key results. And I like to think of them separately as objectives and key results as two separate things. So let me just break that down. So an objective that would get marketing and sales and development and everything to work together. Well, the one thing that I know works well for a lot of companies is to make sure that they've got a sort of what we sometimes call a North Star objective or North Star metric to follow. Which is you know, at the end of the day, everything should file into this one thing. No objective that any other team is doing should exist if you can't somehow justify how it will help that one major objective. And so, like, for example, if your major objective is to maximize revenue from a particular market, then nothing that any other team should be doing should run counter to that. Everything they do should be justified by the objectives that they have. And so OKRs are meant to be set from the top level OKRs are meant to be set sort of at that exact level, but then each team then says, this is how we're going to contribute, this is how we're going to contribute. And then the teams can then look at each other's OKRs and say, is there anything missing between us? Is there anything that you've said that overlaps with us? Is there anything that, you know, if you do your part and you do your part, we're actually going to miss. So we need to find something in the middle to bridge that gap. And one of the magical things about OKRs is not necessarily in the objectives itself, but it's in the process of setting the objectives and communicating those objectives. Because by doing so, you actually start saying, well, this is what we think we're supposed to be doing, and this is what I think that you're going to be doing. If you're doing that and we're doing this, and we've already said at the beginning of the quarter that it's going to miss, then who's going to be doing this middle part? And that's when you start understanding, okay, we need somebody to do this middle part, and that's going to get that all added up.
What I would add is, at least in my experience using OKRs, previously very incorrectly, is that teams tend to have so many OKRs and none of them are the same. So definitely your product and your customer success and your sales and your marketing should not each have different objectives. Otherwise, you're absolutely not working towards the same thing. You're all just trying to achieve different things. And then that's when vanity metrics come into play, because you're measuring yourself based on objectives that are entirely different, and you're not working as a team, which actually leads very well into the next question, which is, do you have any examples or more examples of vanity metrics and how you are able to turn them into more business relevant metrics?
Yeah, there's tons of vanity metrics.
We discussed CSAT and PS.
What could you tell us what CSATs?
So CSATs are customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
So when you message support, you get a little thing that says, hey, how did we do today? And then you rate someone on that conversation. So some people do it via emoji. For those that are intercom users, you get the little emoji bar and you rate your conversation with the agent. Others will give you a little survey and then you rate the agent directly. But what tends to happen is, if not necessarily the experience is poor, but what I've seen is the customer will come in asking for a particular feature, for example, and the support agent will very calmly say, I'm sorry, we'll take it in as feedback. And then they'll rate that conversation as negative because they didn't get what they want. Well, that's not really rating the conversation, that's rating the product. But you're rating the conversation, and so then that vanity metric is affected, but it shouldn't really have been affected. So with any metric, I say take it with a pinch of salt, because you have to understand the context behind it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things is there a decision to be made based on that number? And when you are looking at a number like that, whether it's gone up or down, it's not like there's a key decision to be made. You're looking at each individual interaction going, well, that worked or didn't work, but the end number doesn't really actually help tell us anything. Doesn't help us make a decision on anything. And in that sense, any metric can be considered a vanity metric if it's not key to the business. And that's why vanity metrics, or metrics themselves, will differ from business to business. You can even look at vanity metrics in this sense. Like you could ask a marketing team to get, if I could tell the marketing team, get as many leads as you can. And I bet you that marketing team could get lots and lots of leads. But if those leads are junk leads, they're not going to play very well. It's not going to play out very well when it comes to those leads staying along. They're not going to convert very well, so sales is not going to be happy. And for the ones that do convert, if they weren't very good leads in the first place, they're not going to stick around very long. So success and support are not going to be very happy. And as a result, you can end up with teams going, well, you told me to get leads up, and I did, good job. Whereas if you say, get as many customers who are qualified and are the right type of customers who will stay with us for 12 months or more, yes, it takes longer to measure that, but it creates a much healthier way of looking at focusing your team on the right sorts of leads, rather than just saying, oh, well, I'll get my bonus if I just get 50,000 people looking at this.
And that's when sometimes your sales team will end up selling to the wrong people and promising things that they shouldn't be.
Yeah. On that note, one of the main or one of my pet peeves is the NPS score as a vanity metric, because it is one of the least actionable numbers out there. The NPS score was developed by Ogilvy years ago as a way of measuring success of brand campaigns. And it's not immediately useful for a lot of companies. And yet it seems to be this way of taking this really rough estimation based on this really weird question of whether you'd recommend something or not, which arguably isn't the best question to find out if somebody actually likes your product or not. Simplifying it down, simplifying it again, turning it into a number, and then saying we are 50 or whatever. And then going, great, is that good? And if it goes up by 2 or down by 2, do you pat yourself on the back? Do you give yourself a bonus? What do you actually do with it? And so it's one of these numbers that you're like, great, so now what? In order to get the real insights from it, you have to dig back down into it and find out what actually changed. At which point, if you have to do that, then why are you measuring that number? Why not just go ask the core questions and go find the stuff that actually matters, and forget about the trying to sum it up into some pretty number that doesn't really necessarily help the business. So everyone's vanity metrics are going to be different, and it's the type of thing that, as with any process, it's the type of thing that you'll find out as you practice and iterate and learn from, and try throwing out some numbers, cut down the number of numbers that you use, figure out which of these actually leads to any sort of critical path in terms of getting you money, getting your customers happy, and throw out the ones that don't actually make a difference to your business.
Absolutely. And also it was asked, what kind of metrics should you be keeping track of? Again, I think that depends on the business, on the growth stage of the business. A couple of things that we do track over here are things like time to conversion, for example. So how long does it take for a customer to subscribe? And even then, everything should be taken within context. So I think that the lesson here is, with any metric, understand what you're measuring, why you're measuring, and what the impact on the business is. So as support, for example, just because we get more tickets, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Just like less tickets isn't necessarily a good thing. You have to understand why and where things changed. as an example.
Yeah. And anything that creates busy work or anything that's measuring your busy work as well. I mean, does it really matter that your development team burned down 50 points this week and burned down 56 points last week, when at the end of the day, points are just a rough estimation and there's enough room for error in those estimations that it doesn't actually really make a difference. And so you've done all this adding up and cutting back down and estimating. And now you're like, great, we've now got this chart that says we've done this. Good job. I mean, if it dips a little bit, what do? Like, you don't just instantly hire another developer. You look back going, oh, well, maybe we misestimated that one, or maybe there's something else happening. At which point it's sort of creating a lot of this extra work, but not actually able to action anything out of it.
Yeah, so a couple things have come up. The first is more examples of non-vanity metrics. The thing with non-vanity metrics is, again, it's whatever is affecting your business directly. So things like an NPS score don't affect your business directly. A customer satisfaction percentage doesn't affect your business directly. Things like measuring time to conversion do affect your business directly. There are things like churn rates. Again, everything with context. I'm not just saying go measure these specifically, and they will vary.
Sure.
I know Jen is about to say something, but
sure.
Yes, go ahead.
I was going to say churn rate, money in bank, time to getting invoices paid, time to money, time to first payment, conversion rates from people looking at the site to actually signing up, leads coming in from key flows, things like this that make a key difference. And there's not a huge amount of them, but there seems to be this collection of all these other numbers that can float out of businesses that often weigh down these divisions, when in reality what you could be doing is just measuring much more simple things, and be focusing on the stuff that is actually core to the business.
Absolutely. I think we're going to take one last question, and this is super interesting, and I think you're absolutely going to love it. Regarding objective-based roadmaps, does this method lead to driving objectives to be in a sequence or timeline?
So an objective-oriented roadmap. The idea behind an objective-oriented roadmap is to, as I said at the beginning, ditch your timeline. The problem with a timeline is that it forces you to lay out, it's basically that chart of things to do versus time. The objective version of that is basically allowing you to say, here are the problems that we have, the objectives, like the reasons why we're going to be doing this. Each of these problems should be addressing some core objective behind the company, and the order in which you're going to tackle them. Now, the thing is that it doesn't, if you're a group of people in a company, it doesn't actually matter what the timeline is that you're going to be tackling them. It matters more the order in which you're going to tackle them, because you don't know how big your team's going to be in December of next year, let alone how fast you're able to deliver, especially because things might come at you, right? Things might change that might slow you down or speed you up or mess you about. But if you know that this is what's happening first, and then this is happening, and then this is happening, it allows you to keep focused on, okay, we need to tackle this rock first, and then this one, and then this one. So think of it more as obstacles that lay in front of you, and things that you need to go tackle as you move forwards. And you'll get to those things that happen later on. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't include things that have dates on them, because some things do require dates on a roadmap. Some things are strategically important, like if you're in e-commerce, maybe Christmas is a key date, and that means that you have to put that key date on the roadmap, and include that as an annotation in your next to the objective, saying, well, we're doing this to get revenue, and we're doing this before Christmas, and therefore all the other problems need to move out of the way to get this done in time. And that can be made clear on the roadmap without having a timeline at the top, which forces everything else to have dates on it as well. Other things might be regulatory, like pretty much every company in the world had to do something for GDPR compliance last year. Therefore, every company that we talked to had GDPR stuff on their roadmap with a hard date on there, and that was totally normal. There's always going to be things in there that have to respond to that sort of thing. But just because one thing on the roadmap has dates on it doesn't mean everything should be. But it does allow you to have a sequence, which isn't necessarily the same as saying having a timeline. A timeline is basically saying, well, we assume that this is going to be 1 month, and therefore this is going to be 1 month, and therefore this is going to be 1 month. And therefore, when somebody looks at that roadmap, they go, oh, well, great. So this will be done and dusted by next June, right? Which obviously is wrong because things change along the way. I've seen a lot of roadmaps in my life. I have never, ever, ever seen one that was just completed, as in they said, this is what we're going to do this year. And at the end of the year, they said, check, we did all the things. Every roadmap changes. Every roadmap needs the ability to be flexible. Sequences in the roadmap change, and the timelines that are estimated are always off. Sometimes they go faster. More often than not, they go slower. And that's just the reality of the work that we're doing.
Cool. So I think with that said, guys, we're going to let you go because we've been here for almost an hour. That went by really quickly. Thank you, Janna, so much. Thanks, everyone, for attending today. We will be sending out the recording next week. So if you want to share it or if you had to drop off, then don't worry about it. You'll be watching this in a bit. So thank you. Have a great weekend, and please stay cool today because it's very, very warm. Have a good
Wonderful.
one.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate all the comments.